Zoëthopia, where we believe that knowledge is power. My name's Zoe Robertson. I'm here to empower you through knowledge and motivation, and I am not a professor. Let's get to learning. Welcome back to a new episode of Classic Literature Club here at Zoëthopia, #Lit Club. And today we will be talking about the dark and gloomy, the sexy and mysterious / romantic, the one and only Wuthering Heights. If you remember, last time here at Classic Literature Club, we talked about Frankenstein, and today's book is a book that actually has a lot in common with Frankenstein, and not just that it was written by a sexually frustrated teenager and or a young adult. But both of these are Gothic, they're romantic, they're written in the 1800s. They're written in a frame story with an unreliable narrator. They touch upon subjects such as creating a monster and human selfishness. And today we're talking about the plot of the book, or doing a summary, if you will. Yes, we will be doing videos later on analyzing and going over the characters, figuring out what is the meaning of this book. But this is just, even though it's a small book, it's highly complex. So I feel like we can all benefit from just breaking down the parts of the book because it is a bit confusing. So that's why we're going to do this structured. Now, as I said, Wuthering Heights is written in a frame story, which means that what is happening, or what is being told to us rather, happened a long time ago, and it did not happen to the person who is telling us the story. And there are actually two narrators in the story, one person who is 100% outside of the story, and another person who has a relation to all of the characters, but who isn't the main character of the story. So one person is Mr. Lockwood, who just travels into town and who is renting a house from Heathcliff, one of the main characters, and he's sort of bored, and he gets Nellie, the housekeeper, to dish the tea on all of the characters and what's up with them because they're so weird. And she is the other narrator, and she is sort of raised basically everyone in the story. Half of the people she grew up with, half of the people she raised, and I will say she sort of raised the people she grew up with as well. Mr. Lockwood comes in and he's sort of smitten by one of the characters, and he's very romantic and idealistic in a contrast to the dark and gloomy characters in the story. And Nellie, the housekeeper, has this love-hate relationship with the characters. She loves them because they're family, and she hates them because they're hopeless. So as I said, the story starts with Lockwood arriving at the Grange, which is one of two main houses in the story. You have Wuthering Heights, obviously, as the title says, and then you have the Grange. At this time, Heathcliff has ownership over both Wuthering Heights and the Grange, and Mr. Lockwood is his tenant at the Grange. He arrives there, he meets Heathcliff and his family, and they are just uncharming. They're sort of rude, they're depressing and depressed, and so he's like, Nellie, what is up with that? And then Nellie tells him, and the story starts Heathcliff as a child arriving at Wuthering Heights. The other main character, Catherine Earnshaw, her and her brother Hindley's father had spontaneously adopted Heathcliff on a trip, and so she, Hindley, and Nellie are waiting for the father of the Earnshaw family to come home, and he does, and he has this little boy with him who is melanated and a gypsy, and they are very disgusted, and they can't for the life of them understand why he would bring him in. But then Catherine starts to love Heathcliff, and they become best friends, they become inseparable, they become the most important person in the world to each other. And Hindley, on the other side, Catherine's older brother, starts to hate Heathcliff because he worries that he will be in direct competition with him for ownership over Wuthering Heights. And the father of the Earnshaw family actually starts to favoritize Heathcliff. And Heathcliff is very manipulative, and he knows that he's being favoritized. And on one side he has Hindley, who's abusing him, and on the other side he has the father who loves him, and same with Catherine, but the father has favoritized him, so he will say to him, Hindley, if you don't give me what I want, then I will tell your father what you're doing towards me. Manipulative. It should also be noted here that the scene where Heathcliff is brought into the family can be very parallel to the scene where Elizabeth is brought into Frankenstein's family. The difference is that Elizabeth was blonde and gorgeous, and Frankenstein fell head over heels in love with her from the first moment he saw her, whilst Catherine, first upon seeing Heathcliff, who's melanated, who's a gypsy, was disgusted. In the end, though, their destinies really did end up getting entangled. So Heathcliff feels very certain and safe in his possession at Wuthering Heights until the father of the family, Mr. Earnshaw, dies. Now Heathcliff and Catherine are set under the care of Hindley, who has married someone and finally sort of loves someone a lot. He abuses Heathcliff and he denies him education, and he really degrades his position in society, and he is taunted by almost everyone around him. And Catherine is trying to keep them together. She's like going after school or like after lessons every day and teaching Heathcliff what she has learned, but she is like becoming closer and closer to the neighbors, Isabella and Edgar Linton, because she is finding her position as a lady, whilst Heathcliff is being treated as a servant and therefore sort of becomes a servant in everybody's eyes. At this time, Hindley has a child with his wife, but she dies a few days later, and after that, Hindley becomes a crazy alcoholic who is even more abusive than he previously was. After years of abuse and taunting from everyone around him, Heathcliff finally reaches his breaking point when he hears something being said by Catherine to Nellie. At this time, Catherine has been proposed to by Edgar Linton. She confesses this to Nellie, and she doesn't know that Heathcliff is in the room because Nellie lies to her. And she says that to marry Heathcliff would degrade her, because obviously at this time, this book was written in 1847 and a woman's position depended upon her husband's position. So technically, to marry Heathcliff would degrade her. Anyways, so she says that. She says, to marry Heathcliff would degrade me. And Heathcliff runs out without her noticing. And then she goes on to say, but I love Heathcliff. He is more myself than I am. Whatever souls are made of, his and mine are the same. And he doesn't hear that. That basically he's like everything to her. And she also says that she had a dream that she went to heaven and she was so upset about it that she cried and cried and cried until the angels threw her down back to the earth, and she woke up in her bed sobbing of joy. And she says, like, to marry Edgar Linton would be like going to heaven. I don't belong there. I belong with Heathcliff. Heathcliff dashes out and he just disappears. And obviously she marries Edgar Linton, and then Heathcliff comes back 3 years later. He is educated, he is extremely wealthy, and he's just a perfect gentleman, and nobody knows how. Edgar is shooketh. And Heathcliff does eventually throw Catherine really off her game, because yeah, they begin up this friendship again, and Edgar Linton is so mad, but she's like, you can't keep me from being friends with him. But then Heathcliff finds out that Isabella Linton has a crush on him, and first he's like, that is the worst thing I've ever heard, never gonna be with her. Then he comes back, I think like the day after, and it's like, oh, you know what, I'm actually gonna marry her. And even though Catherine loves Heathcliff more than anything in the world, she knows that he's an abusive and basically terrible person, and Isabella is now her sister-in-law. So she is not happy about this, and eventually they have a big rebuttal, and she falls very, very ill. So Catherine falls ill, and Heathcliff and Isabella elope, and they end up in Wuthering Heights. That Heathcliff is sort of seized from Hindley by manipulating his gambling habits, and so making him indebted, making him indebted to him. And Hindley is also very, very unwell at this time, and although he's getting weaker, he's still, a bad father. He's abusive, and Heathcliff is extremely abusive, and he taunts Hareton, which is Hindley's little son, and he tries to exacerbate all his bad habits and be like, yes, swear, do that, See how little Hareton is growing up in an environment with these two incredibly abusive and terrible really men, but also Joseph, another servant who's very God-fearing and who's trying to raise Hareton to have a lot of pride in his name. So Heathcliff is over at Wuthering Heights abusing an entire family, while Nellie and Edgar are over at the Grange crying over dying Catherine, who is extremely pregnant. Catherine gives birth to Catherine, also known as Cathy. Catherine, the oldest, was called Cathy by Heathcliff, but Edgar never called her that, so he calls their daughter Catherine, basically, or mainly Cathy. And after doing so, she also dies. Before she dies, her and Heathcliff have this very beautiful, very sad moment where they're like, you should have been there for me, you gave up on me, no, you gave up on me. And Heathcliff is like, it's easy for you, you're gonna die. But what about me? How can I live without my life? How can I live without my soul? Could you live with your soul buried in the ground? Very romantic. And then there's this very gross moment where Heathcliff like digs her up and demands to be buried with her, but that's neither here nor there. It is a Gothic tale after all. So Cathy is raised in the loving and kind environment of Edgar Linton and Nellie, and Isabella Linton is able to escape the wretched beast that is Heathcliff because he is so preoccupied basically with mourning Catherine, and she gives birth to a son as well because she was also very, very pregnant. She gives birth to son Linton, which is basically like family pride / screw you, Heathcliff. He's gonna have my name one way or another. So Catherine grows up to be loved and supported and ends up as a very fine and kind lady. Hareton, on the other hand, is neglected by his abusive alcoholic father, who then dies and leaves him in the hands of a man who's just a man who is said to be a beast, a demon, just is a creature straight out of hell, who denies him education just as his father did to him. So Hareton, even though he has very clean blood, like he's from a very good family, he ends up like talking like a servant, and he doesn't even know how to read because Heathcliff is denying him these, for us, basic human rights. Linton grows up coddled. He and his mom, like, that's his family. She's his world, he's her world, and he's very cuddled, and he is sickly and weak, and that is the main parts of his personality, that he is very sick. Obviously, like, it's the 1800s, so we can't know exactly what his illness is, but he's like very skinny, very pale. He freezes even in summertime, has to have on a winter coat. And because of this, he's very mean and abusive to ones around him. Like, it is very obvious to everyone around him that he won't live a long time. But before he dies, his mother actually does, Isabella Linton. So when she dies, he is sent to the Grange to live with his uncle and his cousin, and he lives there for a very short while, under 24 hours, and then Heathcliff demands to get the boy because it is his son. And they are afraid of Heathcliff, so obviously they give him to him. They're like, fine. Obviously they want to keep him, but they know that Heathcliff is insane. And at this point, we're actually really starting to creep up to the point in time where Mr. Lockwood first sees this deranged family. So stay tuned. To make a long story short, well, actually it's not even that long. It's like a 217-page book, so read the damn book. #LitClub. To make a long story short, Hindley dies, Edgar Linton dies, and before this can happen, Catherine is forced to marry sickly and bratty Linton by her evil uncle Heathcliff, who has this idea of, oh, if she marries Linton and Linton is dying, that means that as soon as he dies, then I will get not only Wuthering Heights, but also the Grange. So he actually kidnaps her and forces her to be in the house until she has married Linton, and then she's released to see her dying father. So this is the second person of that family that Heathcliff has kidnapped. The second young woman of the family, rather. So Catherine is forced into the Wuthering Heights household, where Mr. Lockwood first sees her and where nothing good really happens except for that Linton died. Mr. Lockwood leaves the sad bunch and then returns about a year later and is shocked to see a very happy and functional family. And not only that, but actually two people in love. The last time he was there, Catherine was, well, if you read the backstory, then you see that Catherine is this perfect, young, kind lady, which is so weird because in the first chapter of Wuthering Heights, you see her as this brass, rude person who's taunting Hareton about not being able to read, and basically she is saying that he's trash. But now that Mr. Lockwood has returned, she has actually taught Hareton how to read, and through this process they have fallen in love and they are set to be married at New Year's, which is a surprisingly romantic, heartwarming, fantastic ending to such a gruesome, sad, Gothic tale. Like, I never saw this coming. I'm always like, oh, it's gonna end well, it's gonna end well. In this book, you're like, what can possibly happen that is going to be positive right now? Like, everyone dies, everyone's in pain, everyone's abusive, and then it just ends on this very good note. Like, two people that you totally ship actually end up together. And they seem like the most statuesque couple, and I'm so jealous. But what about Heathcliff? Well, he actually grew tired of his same old revenge scheme and abusing people, and he wanted to die. So, he died. And he was so happy the day he died. He was like, haha, I know something you don't know. And people were like, okay. And then Nellie comes into his room and sees him dead, and they're like, the witch is dead. But yeah, he died, and people say that or at least in 1847, people said that they could still hear the canoodling ghosts of Catherine and Heathcliff around about town. So you know, they weren't meant for heaven. They were meant for the earth, and they're bound to the moors. This has been a summary of the classic and epic Wuthering Heights novel by Emily Brontë circa 1847. And if you also want tea on the characters and the thoughts and themes of the books, then subscribe.